The Trump tariffs, you knew they were probably coming, but what are they going to mean for the rest of the world? Are we about to enter a brave new era of trade wars? And is our already sluggish economy going to take another blow? But there are many other things to chew over this week. The Middle East peace deal and what it means for the region, Trump's promise of bold, some would say drastic, immediate action on immigration, plus what to make of his cabinet picks as the dust begins to settle. Welcome to Talking Politics USA. Hello, I'm joined by our correspondent Robert Moore, who you will all know, and Heather Nauert, who you will also know, the former Trump administration official and our key election night guest, amongst many other things, who has been, since we last spoke, down to Mar-a-Lago for a visit to Trump headquarters. Let's begin, shall we, maybe with you, Heather, with kind of mood music. Whatever else the next Trump term is going to be, I think we can all agree that boring is not one of them. So can you give us a sense of the vibe and the mood music and the sort of paint some color of what it's like behind the scenes at Mar-a-Lago at the moment?
Sure. So today at Mar-a-Lago, as with any day since the election, you have a flood of advisors who are with the president, who are, meeting with him, and a lot of people coming down and interviewing for jobs, actually, where the president will call those at the highest level to come in and have a conversation with him about whatever role he sees fit for that individual, or what that certain person might like to do in a second Trump administration. So you have that happening every day. You have members of Congress flying down and other senior people who are all collaborating and working together to determine what the next administration will look like. So far, we're really just at the cabinet level, and we're just starting to fill in some of those, I don't want to say secondary levels, but things like the U.S. Trade Representative. Very, very important role, but yet not at that, Secretary of Defense or Secretary of the Treasury level necessarily, but will be an important one. So that's one of the primary things that's taking place right now. Now, when I was at Mar-a-Lago just about a week and a half ago, you saw a lot of excitement. Republicans felt strongly that President Trump would win this election. You and I talked about that a lot. Like our country has not gone left, but the prior administration has gone really hard left. So this was a pushback against that. But then also prices. Prices have gotten really, really high. Groceries, gas, everything here in America. So the outcome of the election, really a pushback against those two things. Republicans now are really excited about this new coalition that they've put together. For the first time, we have a good number of Latinos and African Americans who are supporting Republicans. Republicans haven't had the benefit of that ever, frankly. And so now to see this, the Republicans are ready to just hang on to those people and continue to try to deliver for the American people in terms of lower prices and a safer country altogether.
Robert, I mean, the Trump camp got every reason, as Heather was saying there, to be feeling great about life. It's a terrific victory, convincing in every way they needed. I mean, it was, still relatively close, but let's not beat around the bush. It was a very convincing victory. And as Heather said, they put together this new coalition, which is interesting in a whole bunch of ways. What's the sort of mood music in Washington? As I said at the start, whatever the Trump administration is going to be, boring is one thing it won't. And we're back to trying to decode, aren't we, what Trump says and how much of it will he do? What is about just getting a better deal here and there? What is the mood in Washington as the weeks count down now to this new Trump administration?
Well, Heather there spoke quite, eloquently about the kind of sense of euphoria and excitement down at Mar-a-Lago, and that sense that the Trump second term is really going to be, he's going to project itself as a sort of coalition of a new coalition of sort of Republican working class voters of all color. So, while that is true in Mar-a-Lago, I think for Democrats, and obviously Washington D.C. is an overwhelmingly Democratic city, there is still a sense of shock. We've seen that in the sort of post-mortem within the Democratic Party in recent days as people struggle to come to terms with the fact that Trump did so well with, for example, Latino voters. So there is a sense of shock in Democratic circles, but I think in the more moderate centrist world, and particularly in the policy world, I think there's a lot of anticipation and some anxiety about what, for example, those tariffs will mean. I mean, yes, we're all suffering from the sort of price shock of inflation over the Biden years, but what are tariffs if they're not also a tax on consumers? So I think in some circles there is also real concern that if this is more than a threat, if he does impose, for example, 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, 10% of tariffs on extra tariffs on imports from China, that amounts to the three largest trading nations with America, then that actually could stoke a whole new wave of inflation and increasing prices for consumers. So I think there is a sort of underlying economic anxiety while also conceding, look, this is a Republican mandate and we'll see what Trump actually brings when he arrives here on January the 20th at noon when he's sworn in.
Heather, you're absolutely right. We did often talk in the run-up to the election, and you said you felt that the Republicans were speaking to many working-class and middle-class American voters in a way the Democrats had ceased to. And you were obviously right. You did win. It was a convincing victory, and it's clear that that constituency was pretty important and that Donald Trump was speaking to them. As Robert was saying, though, inflation, as you know, has been a massive problem. How do you decode what we've heard from Trump so far? He's very specifically said he's going to introduce these tariffs on day one. He's also indicated he's going to take some pretty bold measures on immigration in day one, including potentially revoking birthright citizenship, by which you're entitled to remain in the US even if your parents came illegally if you were born there. What do you think is actually going to happen in the first week of the Trump administration, and what probably is more about pushing opponents into a better deal?
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack there. Among the first things that they will do are issue a lot of executive orders, which the president often will do on day one. During the prior administration, in which I served for the first Trump administration, they had a lot of executive orders, cutting red tape, deregulation, things of that magnitude that actually really make a difference in people's lives and help businesses to be able to conduct business a lot easier. So I think you'll see a flurry of executive orders coming out. Now, President Trump has been very clear that he wants to institute tariffs. Now, I think we should calm down a little bit on that overall. I'm not suggesting that you're being histrionic in any way. But look, Trump views tariffs as a negotiating point. It's a way to start a conversation. And it's a way to say to a foreign government, China, Mexico, Canada, all our top trading partners, look, times are different. Times have changed. We're not going to let you walk all over us anymore. And that is very different from the Biden administration. So view this as a starting point for negotiations, not as an end result. We have an enormous trade deficit with China, for example. And so President Trump wants to rectify that and really wants to have it really become more of a match. And so you'll hear a lot about reciprocal and fair trade. It's something that Trump talked a lot about during his first administration, started to take some steps to getting there, but now I think we're going to see a lot stronger of push. And here's why Trump cares so much about the trade imbalance with China. One, Americans get a lot of cheap stuff from China, textiles, you name it, electronics, all of that. What we've done as a result is, while we've gotten the benefit of cheap stuff, the problem is we don't make anything here in America anymore. Now, of course, we do make some things, but not a lot, and not as much as we need to. And our supply chains are fragile. And as every free nation learned during the COVID era, our supply chains are intertwined, and we can't rely on countries that aren't our allies. And we can really be cut off very easily should something like that happen again. So as we talk about tariffs, in particular with China, what we'll start to see is a real push to start building more things in America again. And I think in the long run, that's great for American workers. And I think that will be well received. Now, you mentioned a cost increase. Yes, I mean, economists say that there will be a cost increase. But here's the thing. I think Americans are going to be ready and willing to accept some of that cost increase for the greater good, and that is more and better jobs in the skilled trades, manufacturing jobs here in America again, buying stuff that is made in the United States versus China. Now, the UK may benefit as well. You may benefit simply because you're able to buy all that cheap stuff from China that we're not buying anymore. So there could be some near-term advantages for the UK too.
Well, I think at this stage, with growth bumping along on the bottom here, we probably take anything, but that's maybe a different conversation. Robert, can I ask you to pick up on what Heather was saying there, particularly this idea that, you know, with Trump, it's always a negotiation. What do you read into what's likely and what's not likely?
Well, I think Heather is absolutely right. I mean, Trump has got a long history of using tariffs quite successfully as a sort of opening sort of negotiating gambit. I mean, remember, he's already actually doing that. On the campaign trail, he talked about additional 60% of tariffs on China. On Monday, he spoke about slapping on an extra 10%. So, you know, already what he said on the campaign trail and what he's actually suggesting he'll implement on day one is different. So I think Heather is essentially right that he does see this as a negotiating tactic. And there's no question that, look, this country is being devastated by the crossing into this country of fentanyl, the chemicals of which are often imported from China and then trafficked through Mexico. So, look, I mean, he is touching on issues that are hollowing out, key parts of America and devastating American families. So I think, essentially it is right to say that he's touching on some of the issues already that most impact American families, concern about prices, concern about the flow of fentanyl into this country. And so, I think he is reflecting, and actually the American people are reflecting by giving him quite high approval ratings on the transition so far. Now, obviously, he's had some controversial picks, but Americans appear to be sympathetic to Donald Trump changing the tone and the nature of the conversation, not just about appointments, but also about tariffs and trying to tackle some of the issues at source, like the huge inflow of illegal drugs into the country.
Heather, viewed from afar, it looks... Sorry, yeah, you want to pick up on what Rob was saying?
I just wanted to pick up on that, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the issue of illegal drugs. I mean, you all know I worked for Secretary Pompeo at the State Department. I worked for Secretary Tillerson. Prior to that, during the first Trump administration, we spent a lot of time on planes. We spent a lot of time negotiating with foreign partners. We talked to China, and one of the top issues with China, North Korea and other things, but was the precursor chemicals that are used to make fentanyl. So even back then, we would have serious conversations with them. And the attitude we always received from the government in China was kind of a shrug the shoulders. They don't care. Now, they did a little bit to help us out, to stop that flow of the precursor chemicals coming into the United States, but they didn't do enough. And so I think this time around, Trump is going to be even tougher with them because, as you correctly pointed out, Robert, there are far too many American families that have been impacted by fentanyl and other illegal drugs. In 2023 alone, more than 100,000 Americans were killed because of drug overdoses. That's a serious number. And as I talk to American families, it's hard to find an American family that somehow has not been affected by illegal drug use or deaths. And so we cannot underestimate just how important of an issue that is, in particular when we talk with China. And then I know we'll get to Mexico later. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Robert, looked from afar, it seems to me that yes, Matt Gaetz didn't make it through, but pretty much everyone else probably will make it through Senate confirmation. Is that fair, do you think, or is there a different mood there?
It's difficult to say at this stage. I mean, there is the kind of conspiratorial theory that Matt Gaetz was always put forward in order to fail, so that at least Republican senators would have one scalp and that other more equal, well, not quite as controversial, but almost as controversial picks would get through. We're talking about Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard, both of whom require Senate confirmation. It's not clear to me that they will sail through. I think, senators are protective of their kind of power of vetting and examination and scrutinizing these picks. So they will certainly go through the records and look at allegations surrounding some of the more controversial picks, but it does seem like others will get through. And don't forget, of course, there's a whole swathe of bureaucrats who will be appointed without the need to be confirmed by the Senate. Stephen Miller, for example, or Sebastian Gorka are going to be on the White House staff, so don't need to go through Senate confirmation. I'd be interested in what Heather thinks, but my judgment is that the Senate Republicans are still going to scrutinize Tulsi Gabbard and Hegseth very carefully, but the others are likely to get through simply because of the scale of the Trump mandate.
Heather, same question to you. Do you feel that most of them will probably get through in the end, or do you think there are other tussles to come?
Well, it's an important process and really important for the Senate to be able to advise and consent and decide whether or not they want to confirm a nominee that the president puts forward. And it's a serious matter. People have to submit to background checks. Typically, the FBI does that. President Trump doesn't necessarily trust the FBI, and frankly, for right reasons. It may sound extreme, but the president saw our Department of Justice and the FBI weaponized against him, and there were some in the FBI who didn't want to approve President Trump's nominees the last time around. Also, Democrats in the Senate, we experience this every day at the State Department, refuse to move along our nominees. Some of these were even career people who had worked for the State Department forever. Some were political nominees. And the Democrats in the Senate, and this is true, this is something that I had to talk about at the State Department podium every day. Every government, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, deserves to have his or her team on the field. We need to have our ambassadors in every country with which we have diplomatic relationships with. We weren't always able to do that last time around because the Senate dragged their feet. So President Trump is determined to get his people through. We need full teams on the ground. It's a dangerous world. We need those people in as quickly as possible, but it has to go through the proper process. One or two might fall away who might not make it in the end, but I think the vast majority will. Scott Bessent announced on Friday as the new Secretary of the Treasury, well-liked, well-regarded on Wall Street. He'll also be an important part of our conversations about trade and our relationship with Canada and Mexico. Also factors in Trump tariffs that he has indicated that he might want to put in place. So I think it's a good team. There are some, though, who may fall by the wayside.
Listen, you've both had enormous foreign policy experience. Heather, you've worked in the State Department under the first Trump administration. Robert, of course, you've been a foreign correspondent all your working life. So can we talk about the Middle East? Heather, maybe I should begin with you because obviously this is a deal that the State Department has presumably been key in brokering. What do you make of the deal? Where does it leave the conflict in the Middle East? And what do you make of Iran's position behind all of this and what this does and equally what it doesn't say about where Iran stands and how Iran is thinking at this moment?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that you mentioned Iran as a part of it because that's really the root cause. And we don't spend enough time, whether it's in the news media or in the government, really focusing on the role of Iran. Hezbollah doesn't move without Iran's consent. So it sounds to me like Iran is looking for perhaps a little bit of an off-ramp. They recognize a Trump administration is coming in. A Trump administration means business. We're not going to mess around as Iran attempts to employ assassination attempts on our senior elected officials. We're not going to play with that anymore. We're not going to play with Iran developing nuclear weapons. We're going to put a stop to that, or at least do the best job that we can to put a stop to that so that we can have a safer world. So I think Iran may be looking for an off-ramp. Hezbollah doesn't do anything unless Iran blesses it. Now, in terms of the agreement itself, it sounds like it's promising. But again, I don't trust Iran. You don't either. Nobody should trust Iran. Hezbollah only works with them. And so Hezbollah has a lot of control all throughout the country of Lebanon. It is a country that is not technically considered a failed state at the State Department, but pretty darn close to it. And so the idea that there would be a 25-mile border between where Lebanese forces backed by the UN could go, between that and the northern border of Israel, is promising. But I'm not convinced that the Lebanese armed forces backed by the UN can really do the job. That's a tough job to do. I've been through the terror tunnels from northern Lebanon into Israel. They exist. They are still there. There is an enemy that wants to completely annihilate Israel. And we in the West really have to understand that that is a severe threat that will continue just because this ceasefire deal is being put in place right now or in the very early stages of that does not mean that things are safe. And I think part of the reason that the ceasefire deal has happened is because Iran and others recognize that President Trump is coming into the office. He means business. He's going to starve Iran of the billions and billions of dollars of cash that it has received through not enforcing oil sanctions and other things throughout the past 4 years during the Biden administration. Trump's going to work as hard as he can to try to starve Iran of the cash that it uses, not to help its own people, not to benefit its own country, but frankly, to fund terrorism all around the world.
Robert, you spent a great many years reporting the Middle East. You've seen peace deals come and go. What do you make of this one? I mean, it seems to me that Netanyahu has ended up really wherever we are, just over a year into this conflict, with pretty much everything he would have wanted so far, except that, of course, Israel has paid a heavy price in terms of the court of world opinion, and that he probably could have done without the arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. But do you think the peace deal is durable? What do you think it means about the wider conflict? And same question asked to Heather about what you think Iran is thinking behind all of this.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd even describe it as a peace deal. I think it's a sort of tentative ceasefire, really, because it's clear to me that Hezbollah still retains some military capability. As Heather rightly points out, it's not clear either that the Lebanese armed forces are going to be adequate to fill the vacuum in southern Lebanon. So I think a peace deal is probably the wrong term for it. I think we should regard it as a ceasefire, and we'll watch it closely to see whether the two sides adhere to it. I mean, Netanyahu made very clear that any movement by Hezbollah in South Lebanon near the border would sort of trigger a military response in turn from Israel. So we'll see about that. I mean, the other point very clearly is that the humanitarian and the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza shows no sign of ending. So that conflict goes on. And obviously, Netanyahu still has to face the reality that 100 hostages are being held by Hamas in those tunnels in Gaza. In other words, that conflict isn't necessarily closer to ending just because the Lebanese war has ended. So there's many different sort of components to this. It's clear that Iran is weakened politically and strategically, but there are so many questions, and above all else, that humanitarian suffering we're witnessing in Gaza. I mean, that endures and indeed maybe even worsens as the winter rains arrive in Gaza, and you can just imagine, without hospitals, without adequate infrastructure, without a housing stock, just how devastating the next few months might be for the civilian population in Gaza, Tom.
Final question to you both. Heather, maybe to you first. I suppose we always find Donald Trump hard to read, and people who love him say that's the whole point, keeps everyone else on their toes, that's what you want the leader of the free world to be doing. People who don't like him just say, well, he's unpredictable and that makes me nervous, and a whole bunch of other things besides. We've been talking about some of the big issues, the Middle East, obviously Ukraine, we've talked about a lot before, talking about tariffs and the impact that might have on relations with neighbors, Canada and Mexico. You've got, of course, immigration as well. What do you think he's going to be focused on? What do you think he wants? How should we think about the first 4 to 6 months of a Trump administration, and what success would look like to him?
Well, first, I think it's going to be very busy. So hold on to your hats. I've said this all along, too. Don't get too caught up in everything he says. I find a lot of audiences take him very literally. And I think you're best served by not taking everything he says so literally. Understand the sentiment behind it. But just because he announces something like a 60% tariff or something of that sort, don't take that to the bank. Understand that it is the beginning of a negotiation. understand that our alliances are important to us. The United States understands, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in office, that we have to have friends, that we have to work with others. The UK, certainly our best and closest friend. That will not change. We will have a terrific ambassador to the UK, that I know, and to other European countries as well. So the relationships will continue to be strong. They may not like his style. They may not like how he says things, but understand that his goal and his mindset is to calm down the world. The world is on fire right now. So that's one of the things that he's looking to do, not with America necessarily always leading the charge or footing the bill for everything. You'll hear a lot about burden sharing. We heard about that 4 years ago. That will make a comeback. So I think that will be one of the successes that he will strive for, calming tensions down in the world. And the ceasefire is just a little bit of a hope in that direction. Ukraine and Russia, that's a whole separate subject we could talk about another time. I know we've spent a lot of time on that one as well. I'd be happy to cover that another time. I think the economy, taking steps to reduce prices will be a big part of it. And then finally, our own southern border. We've had somewhere between 10, according to the government, 10 million illegals cross over the past 4 years, some estimates up to 16 million. I think Trump is going to look to try to get the bad guys out. Some of them, sure, are families who just want a better life, but there are others who are not good actors, who are here for nefarious reasons. And we hear about crimes and murders being done all the time here in the United States. And American families are frankly scared. Latino families, they're even more scared because they came from those countries themselves and know how dangerous some of these actors can be. So we will see a push, I think, to round up some of the worst and deport them back to their countries. Will people who were born here legally be kicked out of our country? I don't think so. So I think we just have to understand President Trump's sentiment, understand what his goals are, not get too worked up about things. I think everything's going to be just fine. And I think we're going to be a safer nation and safer world as a result of his administration.
Robert, what do you think? You covered Trump every dot and comma of Trump version 1. How does Trump version 2 differ? He's more experienced. He's surrounded by people who are exactly the people he wants, which maybe he wasn't first time. We assume he knows what he wants more clearly than he did the first time. What does the first 6 months look like for him in terms of success?
Well, yeah, covered every dot and comma and exclamation mark as well, Tom. I mean, what a ride it was over the first Trump term. I think Heather is right to look at some of the bigger issues, the border, immigration, the economy. That's going to be the focus of the sort of first 100 days of the Trump term. But I'm looking at something else too, which is the tone. I mean, do you remember that first inaugural address he gave when he spoke about American carnage? I mean, is this inauguration address, Tom, which I know you'll be back here in Washington for, will that be equally dark? Or will he try and acknowledge actually that he has built, rather remarkably, a kind of a multi-racial working class coalition? Will he try and actually speak more kind of buoyantly about that and try and turn it into something of a permanent political realignment here? Or will he kind of fixate, as he did in 2017, with sort of the crowd size of the inauguration? In other words, I mean, how many times have we spoken about this? Is he capable of a pivot, of changing from somebody who fixates on certain issues, or is he able to try and cement what I think has been a remarkable kind of political realignment in which the Republican Party has sort of reinvented itself under Trump? So we will see. But as Heather looks at those substantive issues, let's also pay attention to the tone that we'll hear in, just over 50 days' time on Inauguration Day.
I will be there, as you say. Both of you will be there. I very much look forward to continuing the conversation then. Thank you so much for spending the time to be with us today. That is all we have time for. You can catch up on all episodes of Talking Politics USA, including my discussion with Robert last week on YouTube and ITVX, or you can listen wherever you get your podcast. But for now, from all of us here on Talking Politics USA, goodbye.